Thanks for joining me for part 2 of my 1983 West Coast trip that I took with my father, Michael Neild. Previously on Replikator. Dad and I flew to LA, drove to Vegas, saw the Thunderbirds, drove to Mojave, found the Sabre Graveyard, proceeded to Yosemite, then San Francisco, and took the Pacific Coast Highway to LA, where we stayed with my father's cousin, Gary, in Glendale. If you ever stayed up late in the 1980s, you might remember Gary. He was that guy on the E. Joseph Kaufman infomercial that took the course, made a lightsaber toy out of a flashlight and golf tube, and then sold the rights to a toy factory for a cool million. Anyway, Gary's father Ernie flew Lancasters with the RCAF during the Second World War, and not any Lancasters, Lancaster Mark IIs with the radial engines. And his ex-wife, Deanie, was famous for flying a pink traffic helicopter for a Toronto radio station. Somehow, Gary found an authentic Flying Tiger jacket at a garage sale in his neighborhood, so authentic in fact that the Smithsonian offered to buy it. After doing the usual tourist things in LA, we made our way to the Plains of Fame at Chino Airport. Ed Maloney started collecting aircraft memorabilia and then aircraft when he was still a student in high school during the Second World War. By 1957, he had 10 aircraft and opened his own museum, the Plains of Fame. The museum attempts to restore aircraft in its collection to flight status and has supplied many to film productions since it opened. Sadly, Ed passed away in August of 2016, but his family continues operating his legacy, the Plains of Fame Museum. This B-17 is the first aircraft you saw when you arrived back in 1983. It's Piccadilly Lily II. It was built at Long Beach, California, and this was the last B-17 Flying Fortress to be assigned to the 8th Air Force. And it was also the last to serve in the United States Air Force after retiring in 1959 as a drone director. Lily was also a Hollywood star, appearing in The Bloody Hundredth, 12 O'Clock High, Thousand Plane Raid, and Black Sheep Squadron, to name but a few. She was grounded in 1971, but has been undergoing restoration to flight status. This Messerschmitt 262 first flew from Memmingen, Germany on the 14th of March 1945 at the hands of factory pilot Sergeant Otto Kaiser. It was converted to a photo reconnaissance aircraft at Eger, then captured by U.S. forces in May. It was sent to the U.S. It was tested both at Wright and Patterson Fields in Ohio for a total of 4 hours and 40 minutes, in which time it went through 4 engines. Howard Hughes purchased the Stormbird to fly it in the Bendix race, but this never came to be. It was later sold to Caltech Aero, and in 1955, Ed Maloney acquired the rather rough aircraft for his museum. In 2000, the Flying Heritage Museum in Everett, Washington, purchased the aircraft for its collection. The Salamander in the museum's collection was built in March of 1945 at the Henkel factory in Rostock, Germany. It was assigned to JG-1 Osau at Lech Airfield in Holstein, where it was given the code Red 1. It was flown by Lieutenant Gerhard Hanf until the end of the war and was given the name Nervenklau, which translates to nerve jangler. Red 1 was captured and shipped to Freeman Field in Indiana. In 1946, it was sent to Muroc Field, which later became Edwards Air Force Base, where it donned foreign equipment number FE489. While there, legendary test pilot Bob Hoover put it through its paces. After testing was completed, it was donated to the University of Kansas in 1947, who later sold it to Eddie Fisher in 1948, who then sold it to Ed Maloney. Believe it or not, this was the first aircraft that Ed Maloney purchased for his museum. The J-8 M1 Tsushui, or Autumn Water, was to be a direct copy of the Messerschmitt 163. However, an example was not able to be sent to Japan, and Mitsubishi had to do some reverse engineering based only on the pilot's manual and some other ancillary documents. By the war's end, only 7 had been produced and none saw combat. 2 captured aircraft were sent to the United States for testing, one at Glenview Naval Air Station in Illinois and the other to Wright Field. Afterwards, both examples went on display as war trophies. And then the Navy scrapped their example. Ed Maloney purchased the Air Force's aircraft in 1948. The museum's Yokosuka MXY-7 Model 2, Oka, was built in mid-November 1944. It was the first purpose-built suicide aircraft and effectively was a manned cruise missile. Carried aloft by a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, it could carry 3,000 pounds of high explosives. Once launched, its rocket motor would propel it to 500 miles per hour, ensuring no Allied aircraft could intercept it. Aimed properly, it could sink a ship, as one did in April of 1945, sinking the USS Manert L. Abel. Over 800 were produced by the end of the war, making the Oka a significant threat. The museum's example was one of 17 captured by American troops at Kika Airfield in Okinawa on April 1, 1945. 6 were returned to the U.S. for further technical evaluation and later used in war bond drives. The museum's Oka was acquired in 1950 from the United States Navy. If you want to see a Mitsubishi J2M Raiden in the flesh, you better get yourself to Chino, as this is it. While on an Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, the Raiden was a land-based interceptor designed to fly fast to altitude to intercept enemy bombers. Work began in 1938, however, issues with the landing gear, engine, and propeller delayed production until 1942. Only 476 were built, but it was deadly in the roll, and several B-29s were lost in combat to the Raiden. The museum's example was built by Mitsubishi in March 1944 and saw combat with the 302nd Kokutai at Asugi Aerodrome in Japan. Captured at the end of the war, it was sent to the United States for evaluation and wound up at Frank Wid's Trade School in Los Angeles. Later, it was placed in the Traveltown Museum in LA's Griffith Park. In 1952, the city donated the Raiden to the museum. The Sikorsky R-4 was the first mass-produced helicopter and was used for aircrew rescue. This example was built for the United States Army in 1944. I could not find much information on it, but I was surprised to find out that very shortly after this photograph was taken, it was traded to the Canadian Aviation Museum here in Ottawa, where I live now. It's still there, and according to the museum's website, it was traded to the Planes of Fame for a Japanese aircraft. I asked on the Friends of Planes of Fame Facebook group about this, and Dan Jones replied that it was traded for an Apache D-3A Val, which Bob Demerit restored in the 1960s. I think the Planes of Fame got the better deal. At the left, we see the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. It was America's first jet fighter to be deployed to combat units. 4 were sent to England in January of 1945, but they were grounded after an accident. YP-80s were later deployed to Italy to serve in reconnaissance roles, but by the time the war ended, none had seen combat. This example was converted to an RF-80A at some point and served with the Wisconsin Air National Guard. It would later serve as a QF-80A drone before being acquired by the museum. At center is a Bell P-59 Air Comet produced by the Bell Aircraft Factory in Niagara Falls, New York. It was hoped to be the first American jet fighter to see combat, but it was underpowered and the United States Army Air Force curtailed the original contract and proceeded with the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star instead. The 66 Air Comets that were built were used by the Air Force and the Navy as training aircraft. One was even sent to the Royal Air Force for evaluation. Only 6 remain today. The museum's example was modified to hold a seated passenger in the nose for VIP jet familiarization flights, and later to control drone P-59s. After testing was completed, it spent time with several squadrons in California to provide jet familiarization flights. Legend has it, several nurses and secretaries were given such flights. After the war, it too, as with so many other of the museum's aircraft, became an airframe trainer, in this case with the California Technical Institute at San Luis Obispo. Ed Maloney acquired it at some point, and in the mid-1990s it began a restoration program to return it to airworthy status. At present, it's approximately 75% complete. Another fine product of Bell in Niagara Falls is this P-39N Airacobra. It was accepted by the U.S. Army Air Force on the 24th of July, 1943, and it was written off after an accident along the Alaska Highway in British Columbia, Canada on the 5th of May, 1944. In 1971, Dave Tallichet recovered the wreck and later sold it to Ed Maloney. The wings are from a different aircraft, rumored to be a Pacific wreck, and again, rumor has it the aircraft was held together with varying amounts of Bondo. Around 2017, it was decided to restore the aircraft to static condition, and that effort is still ongoing. If you weren't aware, the B-50 was an improved variant of the B-29. During the war, the design of the B-29 was frozen to ensure continuous production, and at the end of the war, the design was unlocked and a series of improvements were implemented. So many that they changed the designation. These improvements included more powerful engines, a stronger structure, and a larger tail fin. They flew on as tankers and hurricane hunters until 1965, when the fleet was retired due to metal fatigue. The museum's example, Lucky Lady 2, is limited to the fuselage and can be seen behind the aircraft in this photo. From the 26th of February to the 2nd of March 1949, it completed the first non-stop flight around the world out of Carswell Air Force Base in Texas. It took 96 hours. Later had a belly landing and was dismantled. The fuselage was placed on display at Norton Air Force Base in California, and in 1968 it was acquired by the museum. Built by Lockheed in Burbank in 1944, the museum's Lightning served as a training aircraft before, you guessed it, winding up at Hancock College in Santa Maria, California as an instructional airframe. In the late 1950s, it was in the hands of a couple of private owners who got it back to flying condition. In December of 1959, Ed Maloney acquired it for the museum. In 1988, it was once again flown after being restored by Robert Pond and has had various paint schemes since that time. This Grumman F-11F Tiger flew with the Blue Angels as number 2, piloted by Lieutenant Bob McDonough. and was one of the original long-nose aircraft to fly with the team. After retiring from the Angels, it was acquired by Ed Maloney. Today is located at the now-closed Plains of Fame in Vail, Arizona, and like all aircraft at that location, it may return to California at some point. Lots of aircraft in this slide to get through, so we'll start at the left. This is a Republic RF-84K Thunderstreak that started life as an F model when it rolled off the assembly line at Republic's plant in Farmingdale, New York sometime in 1952. You could say it had a heck of a career with the Air Force. In 1953, it was converted to a GRF-84F for the FICON, or Fighter Conveyor Project, where 10 B-36s were modified to carry parasite fighters. The Thunderstreak would be fitted to a trapeze mechanism in the modified bomber and flown to the perimeter of a hostile area. Once there, it was released and would carry out its recon run. When completed, it would return to the B-36 attached to the carrier aircraft, and both would return to base. On the 13th of January, while attempting to connect to the mothership, the museum's Thunderstreak was damaged. The project was cancelled once air-to-air refueling technologies improved. In 1961, Ed Maloney acquired the aircraft. Like the museum's Thunderstreak, the Thunderjet was built in 1949 by Republic at Farmingdale. It flew with the 36 Fighter Bomber Wing, which at the time was commanded by Brigadier General Robert Lee Scott Jr., a former Flying Tiger who wrote the book God is My Co-Pilot. Ed Maloney acquired it at some point and was transferred after this photo was taken to nearby Yanks Air Museum in Chino, California. Next up are 4 T-33s. But I can only identify the first example, 53-5156, which flew with the 329th Fighter Intercept Squadron at George Air Force Base in California. We'll talk about the D-558 in the next slide, and yes, that is a real D-558 and not the Hawker Hunter used in the movie, The Right Stuff. Behind the D-558 is a Beechcraft Expediter, which I couldn't find anything on with regards to its history. The Plains of Fame has had 2 Expeditors, but none were bare metal in 1983. And the last for this slide, the Lockheed X-7, also known as the Flying Stovepipe. Development was started in December of 1946 based on a requirement by the United States Air Force for an unmanned ramjet test aircraft with a top speed of at least Mach 3. It did more than that. The top speed reached was Mach 4.3. The X-7 had a unique landing system. While descending nose down by parachute, its giant metal spiked nose would penetrate the ground, leaving the rest of the aircraft resting the ground like a lawn dart. And now we get to naval aircraft, my favorite. At left, and seen in the last slide, is the Douglas D-558 Phase 2 Skyrocket. The museum Skyrocket is the first Phase 2 aircraft to be constructed at El Segundo, California, and was delivered to the Navy on the 10th of November, 1947. Between 1948 and 1956, it completed 122 test flights. In December of 1956, a project was canceled and the aircraft spent its final days as a recruiting tool. Ed Maloney obtained it for the museum in 1966. The Ryan FR-1 Fireball is a real oddity, not only in naval aircraft but in aircraft in general, as it is one of the few, if not the only dual-powered fighter. As you can see, it has a radial engine, but if you look at its tail, you'll notice tailpipe. It's also jet-powered, as it was hoped this would bring a boost of speed when pursuing kamikazes. This was the 11th Fireball, and it was produced in March 1945. It spent its entire career at Ames Research Center at Moffett Field in California, where it participated in a range of testing which lasted until June of 1947. By that time, the Fireballs were being phased out due to airframe fatigue. Like many of the museum's other aircraft, it ended up as an instructional airframe, and it was obtained in 1967 for the museum. And on the right, closest to the camera, is a photo recon version of the Grumman F9F 5P Panther. The museum's example is one of 36 5P versions built, and it flew 110 sorties over North Korea during the Korean War. It was assigned to Squadron VC-61 and flew off the USS Philippine Sea. After the war, it was stationed at MCAS Miami and El Toro. It was converted to a drone controller and finished its career in that role at NAS Barbers Point, Hawaii. It was retired in 1964 and came into the possession of Ed Maloney. Not a lot of info on this Thunderbolt's wartime history. What we do know is that it is a P-47G-15 CU with the CU designation, meaning that it was built by Curtiss Wright, likely in Buffalo, New York. Between 1950 and 1955, the Thunderbolt was assigned to Caltech Aero Institute and then acquired by Ed Maloney. It spent 5 years being restored at Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico and flew for several years until it struck an embankment on landing during an air show at Point Mugu, California. It was once again restored to flying condition and today is in the markings of the Spirit of Atlantic City. Now, I know what you're thinking, and you're wrong. I know it looks like a buzz bomb, says it's a buzz bomb. It's not a buzz bomb. It's actually a reversed engineered copy of the Flisher FI-103M or V1 buzz bomb, and it was made by Republic Ford in 1944. Designated as a JB-2 Loon, it was planned to launch these from B-17s against ground targets during the invasion of Japan. Yep, the USAAF had their very own buzz bomb. Loon, I meant Loon. This is a Convair F-102A Delta Dagger built in 1957 and first assigned to the 61st Fighter Intercept Squadron 327th Fighter Group at Trow Field in Wisconsin. In 1960, it was sent to the 59th Fighter Intercept Squadron at Goose Bay Air Force Base in Newfoundland, and then on to Thule in Greenland. It was then reassigned to the Pennsylvania Air National Guard in Pittsburgh, and finally to the California Air National Guard in Ontario, California. After retirement, it became part of the United States Air Force Museum's loan program and was sent to the Plains of Fame, where it was in 1983. It's now at Castle Air Museum in Atwater, California. Closest to the camera on the right is a RB-26C Invader. Built in March 1945 by Douglas in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it reached Europe in April just as the war was coming to a close. It bounced around bases in the U.S. Southwest until it was converted to a recon bird and sent to Korea in 1951. After the war, it returned stateside and was assigned to the 183rd Transport Squadron Air National Guard in Hawkins, Missouri in 1956. It was sold in 1958 and converted to a fire tanker. It flew for various firms in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia before being retired from fire duties in Alaska. It joined the museum in July of 1980 and flew until 1992 when it was placed on static display. Recently, it began the restoration process, and it is hoped it will return to flight in the near future. To the left of the A-26 is a B-25J built by North American at Kansas City, Kansas, and delivered on the 25th of June 1945 and flown directly into storage at Independence, Missouri. In 1949, it was assigned to Andrews Air Force Base, and in 1951 it was converted to a navigation trainer. Sold in 1959 and converted to a fire bomber, it was based in Alaska until 1978 when it arrived at the museum. In 1986, it was sold to Robert Pond and now resides at the Palm Springs Museum in the markings of Mitch the Witch. It's a Hollywood film star and was featured in Forever Young and Pearl Harbor. For the production of Pearl Harbor, it was launched from the then-active carrier USS Constellation. And here we have another Hollywood film star, the Vultee BT-13, and this one was converted in 1968 and made into a Val replica for the movie Tora Tora Tora. It was later restored and was again used in the movie Pearl Harbor. I won't force you to watch a clip of that movie. At present, it resides at the Plains of Fame Grand Canyon Val Airport, but should be returning to Chino at some point. This Canadair Silver Star was delivered originally to the Royal Canadian Air Force, but it was later transferred to the Royal Canadian Navy when we still had a carrier. It was most likely delivered to RCAF Rivers, Manitoba, where the RCAF and the RCN were also conducting pilot training at the same time. I'm going to be going to Rivers for a series of documentaries, so stay tuned. It was disposed of by Crown Assets in 1972 and found its way south. Kay Eckert of Salt Lake City purchased it, and here's where things kind of get a bit dicey with the history. The NTSB listed this aircraft as being destroyed in a landing accident, but Mr. Eckert commented on an online forum, "It was destroyed when it was rammed by a Utah Air National Guard fire truck in December of 1994 while parked on the ramp. The NTSB report is false. The airplane never crashed at Palm Springs, California." So I'll take the owner's word for it. Sad demise of a very lovely aircraft. This was, and apparently still is, the active flight hangar for the museum's aircraft. I didn't catch serials of the aircraft you can see here, so I can't give you their history. So if you squint, you might see a P-47 Thunderbolt from this profile. This is a Seversky P-35, but it was built for Sweden as a J9 model, and then commandeered by the United States Army Air Force on the 20th of June 1941. So it's an AT-12 advanced trainer because by 1941 it had been surpassed by more modern aircraft. However, when it was first produced, it was pretty advanced for its time. It was the first U.S. aircraft to feature all-metal construction, retractable landing gear, and an enclosed cockpit. Seversky's next aircraft clearly showed its connection to the P-35, although the company had since changed their name to Republic, and that aircraft was the P-43 Lancer. It evolved quickly into the P-47 Thunderbolt. Ed Maloney acquired this aircraft in 1962, and it's been flying since 1979. This Spitfire was built as a Photo Recon Mark 19 variant with a Griffin 66 engine on the 29th of November, 1944. It flew with 542 Squadron and later with 81 Squadron in Singapore. It was transferred to the Royal Thai Air Force in 1954, and in 1962 was donated to Ed Maloney by the King of Siam himself. It was later purchased by Christophe Jacquard of France, where it suffered a crash in 2017, but has since been restored back to flight status. You know the legend. The British were desperate for fighters, and North American designed the Mustang in response to an order based on British requirements in a matter of weeks. This is the Mustang that started it all. The museum's P-51A was built in Inglewood, California in 1943 and was taken on strength by the United States Army Air Force. After the war, it was again at Caltech Aero Institute until Ed Maloney acquired it in 1953. It was restored to flight status in 1981 and mustered 350 miles per hour at the Reno Air Races that year. In 2006, it emerged from maintenance and U.S. markings, and today is still at Chino. Okay, let's channel Doug. This is a Messerschmitt Bf-109 G10 U4, or Gustav model that saw combat in the Eastern Front with JG-52 and with the Hungarian 101st Fighter Wing. It was flown to Neubiberg Air Base in Munich at the end of the war to surrender to U.S. forces and was assigned Foreign Equipment Number FE-122. It was transported, along with the museum's ME-262, on the HMS Reaper to the United States, where it was displayed at Wright Field but not flown. And like most of the collection, it was transferred to a high school, and then to the University of Kansas, where Eddie Fisher purchased it in 1948. Ed Maloney found it for sale in 1958 and added it to the collection. It currently resides at Val, but with everything else coming back to Chino, it's probably going to be there in the near future. So this one is rather interesting, as usually when you see a three-bladed prop on a Corsair these days, it's a Goodyear-built FG-1D model. But this is actually an F4U-1A model built by Vought and accepted into the United States Navy on the 31st of August, 1943. Its history is unknown prior to August 1944. It may have seen combat in the Pacific, or it may have been assigned to a training unit. We just don't know. But by August of 1944, it was in San Diego awaiting repairs. It spent the next year at various bases in California before being stricken from the registry in 1945. In 1960, it was at the MGM Film Studios lot, apparently for a war movie that was never made. Ed Maloney bought it and brought it to the museum in 1967, and had it flying in 1977 when it appeared in the television series Baba Black Sheep. In the early 2000s, it got a back seat for carrying passenger and appeared in its original tricolor scheme. Today, it sports a Korean War scheme it wore during the movie Devotion. And this, my friends, is what I was dying to see, the late-grade F2G replica, the Super Corsair. Little to nothing is known of its origins other than it was a Goodyear-built FG-1D model that was acquired by Ed in 1959. In 1982, it emerged from the shop as the Super Corsair, featuring a Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp Major, a 28-cylinder beast of an engine normally fitted to a B-50 or B-36 bomber. Its turtleback and canopy were lowered and made more streamlined, and in proper Royal Navy fashion, the wings were clipped to allow it to bank and turn rapidly. Topped off with a modified Skyraider prop, the Super Corsair looks pretty badass. It would race under various sponsorships over the years, and would have qualifying speeds sometimes in excess of 425 miles an hour, and obtaining 445 miles an hour in one race. Sadly, it crashed and was destroyed at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona on the 19th of March, 1994. Speaking of the Royal Navy, here's a former U.S. Navy TBM-3 Avenger masquerading as a Fleet Air Arm Harpoon, which was the official British name, but it was rarely used. If this had actually served in the Royal Navy, there would be a seat behind the pilot for the observer, which in Royal Navy parlance is the navigator. And the windows in the radio operator's compartment would be blisters instead of flat. This model was built by General Motors and was accepted by the U.S. Navy in June 1945. It was released from the Navy and served as a firebomber for many years. Its most famous moment was when Big Enos and Little Enos, seen here, dropped fire retardant on a party in Smokey and the Bandit Part 2. In 1982, it was restored as you see it here for a customer in Switzerland, but it wasn't delivered. Robert Pond purchased it in 1983 when these photos were taken, and it was later repainted in U.S. Navy markings. The last information I could find was that the Avenger was now residing in Las Vegas. Off sitting forlorn on the ramp was the sole surviving Douglas A2D Skyshark, which was hoped to be the successor to the A1 Skyraider. It was a beefier aircraft fitted with a pair of turboprop engines, and the program was cancelled after a series of gearbox explosions and crashes. This example was never flown, which is probably why it survived, and was used as a ground radar calibration target at LAX. It was later donated to the museum and now resides at the San Diego Air and Space Museum Annex at Gillespie Field. So if I wasn't frothing at the mouth after seeing the Planes of Fame collection, I completely lost it when we drove by the graveyard. It belonged to David Talashay's Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation. Tallichet was born in Dallas and flew B-17s in combat missions over Germany. After the war, he flew transport aircraft, and while still on active duty, was transferred to the New Mexico National Guard flying P-51 Mustangs. He remained on active reserve status until 1957. He made his money in the restaurant business, and from the number of planes he owned, did quite well for himself. Tallichet died at his home in Orange, California of complications from prostate cancer at age 84 in October of 2007. So back to 1983. Here I am talking planes with a U.S. Air Force vet who happened to be on a road trip to Chino with his father. You can see a couple of A-20s, and at the far left a Pisaki H-21 is peeking out. And on the right are fuselages of B-26s. From what I could find, one of the A-20s was an A-20H model, converted after the war as an executive transport, and its ownership bounced around the Southwest for a few years. In 1949, the U.S. Marshals seized it as attempts were made to sell it to Israel. In 1953, it was sold to the Nicaraguan Air Force as an executive transport. It was placed in a park in the 1970s and was brought back to the States by Tallichet in 1977. In the 1990s, it was restored to flying condition and was loaned out to a few museums until it was sold to Latvia. Today, it is on display in Russia. So folks, here's where I hit the wall trying to figure out the history of any of the other aircraft you'll see in these photos. If you have any information, I'll look forward to your comments. In this image, there is a Curtiss P-40 of some sort, could be a P-63 I guess, and a collection of B-26 parts. In this next slide, more B-26 parts and a Japanese something. I remember at the time the vet and I were able to identify it, but that memory got lost at a concert somewhere down the line. Anyway, if you have any information, help a brother out, look forward to your comments. I know you're thinking these are Douglas Dauntlesses, but you'd be wrong. In fact, they're Douglas A-24 Banshees of the United States Army Air Force. Okay, I know they're pretty much a Dauntless. I'm not sure which is 42-54654, but it was constructed by Douglas at Tulsa, Oklahoma sometime in 1942. After the war, it was sitting around the MGM lot until Tallichet bought them in 1979. In 1991, restoration started with the intent to fly it again, but from what I've seen, it never did. It currently resides at the Pima Air and Space Museum at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. And, of course, more B-26 parts. And here we see the A-24s along with the P-40's tail section. Again, comments welcome. And folks, or from what I've seen in the stats, gentlemen and three ladies, glad you could make it. But this is our last slide. I know, it's a surprise, more B-26 fuselages. The wing and engine sections of a A-20 or 2, and the H-21 in the back. You'll also find the fuselage of what I have read was a HA-1112 Bouchon, or Spanish-produced BF-109, and at the back, fuselage of a B-24 and the nose of a Ventura. And with that, this episode comes to a close. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't subscribed, please consider doing so. I've got lots more videos coming, including my cross-country trip to see World War II Canadian airfields. Give the video a like if you think I've earned it, and ring that bell so you'll never miss an episode. I'll be giving a major channel update next, probably be launched right after this video, so stay tuned, you don't want to miss it. And as always, stay where you're at, another video's coming to where you're to.